All right, welcome inside. As I said before, we encourage you to sit further forward. And this is an interactive session, so it's a round table where we encourage, we're gonna first kick off with, I'm going to do a small overview of the topic of marine carbon dioxide removal, or mCDR. Then I'm going to ask each of the panelists one question, and then I'm going to ask the audience a question, and that's really when we're going to kick off the discussion part. So in this beginning part, start thinking about any topics that you have, any questions, any comments. We want this to be an interactive session. So first of all, I'm Kalina Grab. I'm a research associate at the Marine Policy Center at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which is located in the US on Cape Cod. And here at COP, we've heard a lot about the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And a lot of the projections, particularly in the IPCC 6th assessment report, have stated that we cannot reach our climate goals without negative emissions technology, including carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. The ocean is the largest dynamic carbon reservoir on Earth, and it stores more carbon, many times more carbon than land, than the atmosphere, and than blue carbon. And therefore, there's a lot of different marine carbon dioxide removal techniques, or mCDR, as we will often refer to it today, that are being considered. So there's several different types of techniques that include biotic and abiotic types that are being proposed, and all of these require additional and rigorous research in order to determine if they are effective at storing carbon, if they are safe, and what their possible impacts on the environment could be. Because of this interest in mCDR, there has been a lot of funding that has been coming in the last few years. So last year, NOAA and the DOE, which are government agencies in the US, provided tens of millions of dollars for research into mCDR. Canada also recently announced funding. This was for CDR, not mCDR specifically, but that was a recent announcement. And there's also a lot of interest in the private sector. For example, there's a lot of different companies that are spinning up to look at the viability of these techniques. And Ebb Carbon recently received a lot of investment from Microsoft, where they purchased future carbon removal credits from them. And with this interest across the sectors, the private and public sector, there are also ongoing conversations of how do we ensure that mCDR research is ethical, equitable, and it is conducting proper engagement. And so that's what we are gathered here today to talk about. Just a few highlights. So at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where I work, we put out a position statement on mCDR, where we talk about the need for unbiased research, the need to engage communities, and the need to do ethical research so that we can assess if the techniques are viable and safe for the environment, and also say if they are not effective at sequestering carbon. Also, I won't get into these in too much detail since some of our panelists can talk on them, but their AGU put out the ethical principles for climate intervention research, and the U.S. White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy recently released the National Marine Carbon Dioxide Removal Strategy, which also highlights engagement and the need for responsible research. So with that, I would like to get into the discussion part of this, since that's why we are all here. I'm going to kick it off with a question to each of the panelists and ask that you keep your responses around 3 minutes or so. Throughout the day, I might give some suggestions that we speed up things a little bit, just because we want to be able to have enough time so that everyone can share their voice as well. So to start, so Janice is from AGU. I'm curious, how can AGU's ethical framework be taken into action and applied to the mCDR community?
To be here. Oh, I think now people can hear me. I popped into my own ears here. a sentence or two into my comments. But I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for expressing your interest in this very, very important topic. And I want to thank Woods Hole and the Ocean Pavilion for hosting this. Let me talk a little bit about AGU. The American Geophysical Union is an association supporting 500,000 Earth and space scientists in 192 countries in every part of the world. We publish 24 peer-reviewed scholarly journals, we convene meetings, and we provide career support and training throughout a scientist's career, from their student days all the way through to those who are very experienced. We also, very importantly, advocate for scientific ethics. So when it comes to this topic, though, AGU's stance is very clear. We believe that aggressive action to reduce carbon emissions has to remain the primary strategy for reversing and addressing climate change. We really believe there's no substitute for that. However, we know that there is a lot of interest in technologies and strategies that are under the umbrella of climate intervention, and that research continues to not only happen but is growing, including marine CDR. So AGU believes society should rely on a strong foundation of scientific evidence, and that it should be guided by a well-defined ethical framework, which is what we've tried to do. We have tried to fill that gap. And last month, AGU released its ethical framework principles for climate intervention research. They were developed over 2 years in partnership with a global panel of experts in climate science, technology, ethics, and policy. There was a very rigorous public comment period where every comment that was submitted was responded to, replied to, and considered. So it has a very, very broad input and deep input from not only the scientific community, but related disciplines and also the community. So our 5 key principles are responsible research, climate justice, inclusive public participation, transparency, and informed governance. These build on earlier guiding principles that were specific to climate intervention. This isn't the first attempt at this. It's the latest attempt. So we took all of the work that had been done previously on ethics for climate intervention and tried to incorporate it and update it and make it relevant for today. It also draws heavily from ethical precedents that were developed for biomedical research and genetic engineering, both fields where the stakes for humanity and the environment are profound. And we thought there was a lot in common between those issues and climate intervention. So the framework's designed to guide ethical dialogue for not only carbon dioxide removal, but also solar radiation modification and other emerging or even future ideas in this area. We believe that by discussing openly the benefits and risks of these technologies and asking the tough questions about what responsible research should look like, we can get to responsible decision-making for equitable, science-based, informed solutions for our climate challenges. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Janice. Yes, and I'll be really excited to hear during the discussion period some other people's thoughts as well on the ethical framework and how it can be applied to mCDR. Rocky is from NOAA, the Senior International Affairs Specialist. And Rocky, I'm curious if you can tell us what the United States government has been doing to encourage engagement of interested parties, tribes, and indigenous peoples as mCDR research moves forward.
Thanks. Thanks, Kalina, for the question, and thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm really honored to be here, and thanks also to the Ocean Pavilion for hosting. NOAA's really proud to be an Ocean Pavilion partner again this year. And I think that's a really good question, and I think this conversation felt really timely because, as Kalina mentioned, it was just last week that the U.S. released our mCDR research strategy. And this strategy really focuses on looking at safe and effective approaches to mCDR and really trying to better understand in the research perspective what are the potential benefits, what are the risks, and then what are the sort of trade-offs that we need to think about in that context. And the idea is for the U.S. government is really to accelerate mCDR research in a way that is safe and effective and to really understand better if these approaches that have been put out are viable climate solutions. And that's really the thrust of the strategy. I think there's two things I'd like to highlight within the strategy that I think Kalina gets at your question. One is the development of the strategy. So similar to AGU, we had a public comment process where we had a variety of written comments come in. We also had several listening sessions as we were developing the strategy, including, I think, 4 tribal listening sessions, so specifically focused on tribes. And then the strategy itself has a section that's devoted to community engagement and involvement of various groups, including tribes and indigenous people. A couple things I'd like to highlight from that component of the strategy. One is a focus on environmental justice. So one of the things that we strongly recommend is that projects should think about equity at all stages of the proposals. So the development of the proposal, resource allocation, siting, and even the close down of the proposal. So really thinking about research in that framework. And then the other piece is really thinking strongly about collaborative stewardship with indigenous peoples. So where possible and appropriate, we do strongly recommend collaboration with tribes and with indigenous peoples on the design of projects, the implementation, and sort of the follow-up that comes from there. We also do encourage tribes and indigenous people directly to lead research in this area as well. So these are some of the principles that have come out, and I think coming back to NOAA, which is where I sit, we're hoping that the strategy as it rolls out will help us really better align our research strategy, our broader NOAA research strategy with community needs. And then we're also hoping to continue to encourage really community involvement and starting to better social sciences around what are community concerns around these types of approaches, what are the key research and community questions that should be asked, and how can we more effectively communicate with different interested parties that are involved.
Thank you, Rocky. And yes, it's wonderful to hear from the strategy how it's really kind of talking to this subject. And so, yeah, I agree. It's very timely that it came out last week. So Danielle is the Chief Communications Officer at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And Danielle, WHOI is one of the major institutions that is currently pursuing mCDR research, including field research. So can you please talk about what the process has been like and what you've learned from communicating to the public, such as rights holders?
Yes, thank you, Kalina. And I'm happy to be on this panel. I just want to step back and talk a little bit about Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We're the world's leading independent science, exploration, and education organization. At any one time, we have 800 projects happening around the world. We're very much rooted in high integrity, independent science, and that's why we feel like we have such an important role to play when it comes to mCDR research. As you see around the Ocean Pavilion, a lot of the messages about science needing to lead so that we can test different solutions to see how the efficacy and the safety of the different climate solutions. And currently we have several projects underway, including one on ocean alkalinity enhancement, another one on iron ocean fertilization. And it's been quite a learning experience over the last year. As Chief Communications Officer, it's my role to go out there and help advance the work that we're doing, but also be aware of some of the sort of research we might be doing that might be more controversial. So we had flagged this as potentially a controversial subject. But that really, our intuition was proven true when in February, a Wall Street Journal article was published that featured our ocean alkalinity enhancement project. that was titled "Scientists Resort to Once Unthinkable Solutions to Cool the Planet." And while the coverage in the article was pretty accurate, the comments were very telling. Thousands of comments that were probably 99.9% negative. And they ranged from, "What are you doing? You can't do that. You can't harm the ocean," to "Hooey. What are you thinking?" And to my favorite is, "Why would you do this when climate change isn't real?" Right? So, and since then, it's been a real learning experience for our scientists. It's not business as usual, right? They're not used to having to go out there and do this social, license, to operate. And so we had to come together, our leadership, the communications team, and the leads on the different science projects to really sort of tackle this. What are we going to do? How do we approach this? And from that, we developed the position statement that Kalina mentioned. And also just really started to develop a full approach communication strategy that had to do with engaging and addressing concerns first and foremost. So our scientists getting out there, meeting with the local First Nations and Indigenous communities, discussing with, like policy and regulatory bodies, interested public, the fishers, getting out, communicating and engaging. And that has been really important to the process and an eye-opening experience for our scientists. Our scientists are not used to doing this, right? And it's really important. We have a great team. We have one in the audience that's out there weekly, going out and meeting with the different communities, engaging them, educating them, informing them, and really maintaining our sort of the independence of the science and the work that we're doing. Some of the just key takeaways, and we have a lot, but just to highlight a few. One, engage as early as you possibly can, right? We did not do that at first because we didn't feel like we were ready, right? So, but going forward, we're like, as soon as we can get out there engaging with the communities, the better. Next, scientists. Scientists are at the core of this engagement strategy. People don't want to hear from folks like me, communications and PR specialists. They want to hear from the scientists. We're there supporting them, helping them with their materials, their talking points, but the scientists really need to be engaged in this process, whether they want to or not. It's really important. Communications teams, institutional leadership need to go into this with their eyes wide open. There is brand risk, right? And we have sustained brand risk. We need to be supporting our scientists as they go on out there and doing the work that needs to be done to test, the efficacy and the safety of these solutions. And lastly, and I think very importantly, we need the funding to do this engagement, right? So, with the current projects that we have, they have not been funded to go out there and do these engagement efforts. And going forward, and a lot of the funders aren't providing that funds. But we do need to make sure the funds are there that we can properly engage and we can move forward with this important research.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you for sharing some of the lessons learned in the project so far. So David is President and CEO of WDusk Energy Group and from the First Nations in Canada. And David, we're still in the early stages of mCDR research and in many ways still trying to learn how to properly engage and to conduct this research. So recognizing that they're not a monolith, I'm wondering if you can talk about ideally how you would like to see the research community engage with the First Nations and Indigenous communities on mCDR.
For sure. Testing. You can hear me? Excellent. So yeah, I think, first of all, my name's David Isaac. My traditional Mi'kmaq name is Wagadusk. I'm actually from the territory near Woods Hole headquarters in Quebec, New Brunswick area of Canada. I predominantly work with Indigenous communities, mostly on things like solar and renewable energy. And even in these so-called proven technologies, I guess one of our biggest criterion to meet is this project de-risked enough for a small community, an Indigenous community, in the financial sense, but as well as the social and environmental sense as well. So when you talk about these types of leading edge, cutting edge technology research, I think the onus is even that much higher in terms of standards, and it's very heartening to hear from everybody here that it's not taken lightly at all. So I think it's a good opportunity to you know, evolve some of the community engagement strategies. And being in Canada, where we do have some progressive legislation happening right now, particularly around the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights of Peoples. The First Nations Health Authority in BC, British Columbia, where we're from, is adopted more of a holistic, non-linear understanding, whereas the WHO is more Western-centric, very linear, patriarchal, you could say, in some senses. So I think we also have to be aware, the Western bias of research, of course. I'm coming from an Indigenous worldview perspective where we see nature as much more interconnected. It's something that you don't tinker with much. And so I'm more of the thought to work on systems that are regenerative and less so anything that has the word artificial, unless it's, say, a reef or something of that sort. But I do understand the urgency given the climate challenges we have. So for that, I think it's important to, at the very least, you have to engage First Nations, Indigenous communities very early on, perhaps bring them into knowledge groups. In Canada, we also have, we're working on some legislation around standardizing that in terms of, particularly around health in the environment. So I think there's some good other sector examples of engagement around Indigenous communities. But you know, I think human history is filled with attempts to alter or augment the environment, and immediately that, of course, I think is going to be the biggest hurdle, as you guys are seeing in terms of the larger population, is anytime you hear the alteration or the tinkering, if you will, albeit scientifically and in a very safe manner, it does lead to concern. And historically, Indigenous people have been sort of at the front lines, or the unintended consequences have fallen in our backyard, so to speak. So it's something that has to be, proceed with extreme caution, of course, and again, de-risk. And I know it's very difficult to have a metric to de-risk technologies that still need to be proven. So in terms of effects. So. Yeah, that's a very tough question, but I do, I am heartened to see that it's being taken seriously.
Thank you very much for sharing your perspective, and I really like the examples of different sectors, in different ways that your communities have been engaged as examples. So Leonardo is the Director of International Partnerships from Ocean Visions, and Leo, I want to ask you, as a convening and catalyst organization, how can you help ensure proper engagement, ethics, and equity are carried out by the mCDR community?
Thanks, Galina, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this very relevant roundtable. So I will start saying that in my previous academic life, I was working on issues of large infrastructure systems. So mining, energy infrastructure, and all the types of engagement that has to work there, social license. And it's really interesting to see how we are dealing with an issue where we are talking, for the most part, about small research projects, but we are treating them as very large scale or large objects. One of the reasons, I think, goes into the ideological philosophical problem here, which is the potential for scaling and assumptions of a slippery slope, or what could happen if one thing works, or if, for example, there is not enough transparency, that something could go very wrong, it's hidden, and then there is a catastrophe. So always with nuclear examples on the background. So there are so many ways in which this is compared to other things. And it is the challenge, of course, with new objects that are put into the world, that are emerging, and then we have to define them. And there are so many groups trying to put a definition on it and to say like, okay, we should definitely not continue with this, or we should, in some fringe cases, go all the way in. So for Ocean Visions, something that is highly relevant is to understand the proper scale of the problem that we're dealing with right now, clarifying what is it that it's happening, so transparency about the types of initiatives and that are taking place, and regulatory clarification. And so in those two terms, so one is communication of science, all the elements of what these techniques can entail, a lot of ocean literacy, so elements of like what are the ocean processes involved, what are some of the risks involved, like we have roadmaps to increase understanding about these techniques, but we are also working on things like creating new environmental impact frameworks for these technologies. So those are quite relevant components. In addition, we also have, we're very lucky to have the American Geophysical Union working on ethical frameworks for climate interventions research. So I think that that's highly relevant. And in addition to that, we should also have enough regulatory clarification to understand what is already out there, what are the processes that are required to follow, like all the steps to do an experiment, or what is the regulation about this. And this is where things get more tricky, because this is so far a very small sector that has, as Daniel was saying, high opposition. And there are many things that are mixed up in this situation. And this is something that not even governments are immune to. So, as you say, like we're convening, like we are building a community, but we're also trying to catalyze action. So to catalyze action, we need to understand what's the road to do certain things. To do that, and I think this is one crucial part of our work, especially this year, we have been trying to understand what role every intergovernmental agreement has for this work. We can understand at domestic level many things, but there are other clarifications that are not so open right now. And that's where we have been going through to CBD, UNFCCC, to see all the spaces where this is falling and what has been done so far and what needs to be now make more clear. And one piece there that we found that is really difficult is London Protocol, because London Protocol creates this sensation that there is like a prohibition existing out there for science. And of course, that is connected to, once again, another moment in time when there was a moral panic about an experiment, and the reaction was to say, okay, we have to put all these limitations on research. And that is not unique, but it's certainly a rare case where science is being regulated at that like very high level, in this case, at the International Maritime Organization type of structure. And what we have found is it's still a relatively tricky thing. So there is a prohibition on the deployment of infrastructure, of the deployment of geoengineering, but specifically ocean iron fertilization. But it hasn't even been ratified. There are so many things that need yet to happen, and the world has changed so much. So we are in a moment where even that type of pieces that are at the highest level are under question. And at Ocean Visions, what we're doing is engaging exactly with the frameworks of the UN. We're working with the UN Ocean Decade. We're trying to clarify for the scientific community what could potentially be changed, what is needed right now, and opposing the needs of the scientific community and the needs of those who are advocating for additional steps in mitigation technologies, and what we are going against in terms of the regulatory landscape. So I think those are important steps, and I think it's fundamental so that this work is conducted in an ethical way.
Thank you, Leo. And yes, thank you for providing the work that you're doing across the scientific community and on broad scales, pulling from other topics as well that you work on. So now we want to dive into more of the roundtable style of this. So as a reminder, I will ask you all to keep your comments brief, about, think 1 to 2 minutes. And we want to hear from as many people as possible. Everyone in this entire room is free to ask questions, provide answers, ask questions of specific people. So we hope to just see where the discussion takes us. I have a few questions that that I have. So to start, I'm going to ask the audience, what are your biggest concerns related to mCDR in regards to ethics, equity, and engagement? Does anyone have any thoughts that they've been hearing from?
I'll kick things off. I work in the UK, and locally to me, a company I think from Canada has been putting materials into the sewage system to raise the alkalinity of the sea. And they're doing that to escape the London Protocol, because you wouldn't be allowed to do that directly into the ocean. But I think that's sort of a dodgy way of doing it. It doesn't look good amongst the local people. So I'd like to ask specifically what Woods Hole did to get into trouble with the public in terms of their experiment. I don't know about it.
Well, we haven't done anything. We went through the proper, we're very controlled experiment, going through EPA permit process and trying to engage, the public and the media. And through the public comment period of the EPA, that basically opened up, a bunch of opposition. And there's been no experiment yet. We have a field trial scheduled. It was supposed to happen this past summer, but what as often happens in oceanography, the ship broke and we were not able to secure a ship, which is true. Though people said, "Wow, yeah," but no, and so that is scheduled again for next year. So we've done all the lab experiments at this point. The scientific community is waiting for these field trials. It's very controlled, small-scaled, and so, yeah, we haven't, but the opposition has been incredible. We had an environmental group run a, paid campaign against us. The media coverage has been incredible. For someone like myself, it's like, oh, great, New York Times, AP, 60 Minutes, they're interested in us. But in this case, we've very much had to control it, right? Optics is so important. And so, getting our scientists out there, we've done so much media training with them. It's been a real investment. So.
Yep. So I just wanted to make one comment about the Cornwall case, the planetary case. So one thing, I will not call it dodgy. I think that's an accusation for the method and what they're doing with utilities. They're doing it in Canada now. They have a permit in Halifax to do this. And in Cornwall, there was a mixed reaction. There was a campaign also, kind of paid campaign against the company. But I think there is also a lot of disinformation, and it's really important to emphasize this. There are publications about this experiment, one done by Plymouth that came out earlier this year, that established that all the steps and every aspect of that experiment was safe. So I think creating this aura of suspicion and saying that these are people who are doing something extremely negative or are trying to harm someone, I think that's not the purpose of what they're trying to do. And their experiments are done for the sake of establishing if we can do something additional for the climate issue.
Thank you. My name is Martin Zimmer. I'm a mangrove ecologist at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research in Germany. So I work on blue carbon. And I have two concerns. One is related, well, on one hand, I'm of course very happy to see all over the world in the end how happy people are about nature-based solutions when it comes to blue carbon. So that's really cool. There's a lot of support. At the same time, and that's my first concern, is there is some over-expectation, I think. People expect too much from that solution. And it's very difficult to make clear that as much as I'm in favor of doing it, it's mostly about climate change adaptation rather than mitigation. And that's something we need to popularize a bit more, I guess, so that people don't expect too much. And the other concern is, of course, the opposite of that is that people, at least in Germany, that's where I mostly can talk about, is people are really against any technical or not nature-based solutions when it comes to climate change mitigation. That's a real issue, but at the same time, we are causing this issue ourselves because we don't talk to the people. I mean, we heard several times now that we should involve people, local actors, local communities from the very beginning, and that's what we are also always preaching, but we don't do it. And this is something where I really think we have to work on. Thank you.
I am Ilaha from Azerbaijan, and people don't know about the problem. We should say everywhere. We should say them this is problem our world. We should save this world. Everybody should save this one whenever they can. Small things they should do for our world. Thank you very much. Thank you all of them who is here helping the world to grow up very good.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm thinking about some of the panelists might have something to say about this, but it sounds like we're hearing that there's a disconnect between the science that's going on and what the community understands about it and knows about it. So I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on how can we better communicate this or better engage or make sure that the communities can understand and from the start what is going on and be a part of that process.
I think what's been missing from this discussion so far is that everyone has values. And the reason the public are challenging this whole area is because it's against their values. So what they see is an ocean which is already suffering from significant degradation, now being used to tackle the climate crisis by putting more stuff in the ocean. And until we recognize that, we're not going to get anywhere with dumping more science on them. There's a very interesting book whose title has just escaped me. But what we really need to do is try and deliver that information in a way that it can be used by the public and indeed policymakers to communicate what the options facing us really are. And then they can use their values to make a judgment as to whether or not this is acceptable. Values are absolutely key in this argument.
Janice, you wanted... All right, many thanks to Kalina and to Janice. Having been involved in the start of the ocean decade, I started to think about what we are actually doing. And the decade is successful because, it creates an enabling environment for the ocean science and takes it through co-design in I would say, ethical dimension. So, direction. Everything is, in that sense, if we compare what is positive, what is less positive, it's more or less positive. But when I think about mCDR, and actually I was invited to work also on that topic, the philosophy of mCDR, and this is what like Alex also mentioned, is not yet in place. Because this is indeed not a new business. This is not a new Klondike, Golden Rush. It has to be done because we are trying to see if this is possible, basically to create a positive impact for the planet Earth, maybe at the sake of the ocean, which is very, very difficult thought to accept. So I think what is probably needed in terms of methodology would be strong communication, not only to the world, but also between all the groups that are now involved in that research. And I really count on Leo because you started to think about frameworks for environmental impact assessment. So, and when I compare the pace of development of mCDR research, which is not very high, but at the same time it exists, and the pace of development of environmental impact assessments, I think the first thing is going faster. Then it should be wrong. It should be the opposite. So maybe we should focus on understanding how ecosystems function, have much better description. In the global ocean observing system, biology, ecology is underdeveloped. So we need to move also into that. So I think there is a possibility, I think, of organizing our work on certain things a little bit more strategically, and that would be, for me, also ethically.
I just want to build, I think Vladimir really hit it, and I'm going to try not to repeat what he said, but it seems to me, I think Kalina and Vladimir both make some important points. There is a lack of knowledge, which triggers a fear, which triggers suspicion. Those are very natural reactions. And what we have proposed and just put out into the world is a decision-making process. Get everybody around the table at the very beginning, hear those voices, and as Vladimir said, co-create, co-produce, co-design the kind of research that is needed to potentially advance these technologies and these strategies. Otherwise, I think you do get a very emotional reaction. People worry because they don't understand who he's doing. It may be wonderful, but they don't get it. And, it's maybe this panel except me. I'm a lawyer, not a scientist. So maybe everybody on this panel understands who he's doing other than me. But how do we explain that to the public at the very beginning? Work with them to talk to them about, well, okay, maybe we won't get so close to this fishery. Maybe we won't get so close to this piece of land that has a historical and cultural significance. So I do think there's a path, but there has to be a give and take from all sides.
Yeah, thank you. And David, not to put you on the spot, but I'm curious from your perspective as First Nations and Indigenous people, what do you think is needed? And maybe based on other experiences that you've had.
Yeah, so first of all, a lot of the comments and also responses have resonated a lot. I think, yes. So from the Indigenous perspective, there's a real pure, there's a purity in terms of a purist approach, I should say, to nature, and much more, I guess you could say, qualitative and almost philosophical. So, yeah, there's an immediate dissonance when you hear anything along the lines of geoengineering in particular. I think the biggest fear we have right now is the atmospheric geoengineering. That's of course a very nightmare type. I've seen that sci-fi movie and I know how it ends, or we all have. But I think, yeah, we are in an age of information, yet we're also in an age of disinformation. And so being able to articulate and have the scientific humility, I suppose, to tell these communities that, yeah, there are a lot of unknowns. This is the consequence of, industrial, agricultural, mega engineering. We have manipulated environments for the last few hundred years. So we do know that there will be unintended consequences. And the question is what are those unintended consequences? Are they irreparable? And will they be equitably distributed in terms of consequence to First Nations, Indigenous communities? My suspicion is no, or there is not an answer for that. So being honest at the outright, I think, is quite important, as hard as that is strategically. And from a communications perspective, I think it's going to take some real honesty that, yeah, we don't know. And I know in science and in getting research, that's typically not a good, necessarily the best first step, but it is quite necessary. I also suppose, I think we also have to almost have like a metric or some sort of coefficient that really that takes the risk of research and sort of pits it against the rewards. And the other question is are we really, you could say this about my field of renewable energy and other places as well, are we diluting or taking away our interests or our efforts towards true systemic change? And really that's what it takes, is a systemic change effort. Of course, this research is in response to that and the lack of systemic change, but perhaps it gets a little circular there. But I do think there needs to be some sort of coefficient, some metric that looks at the unknown intended consequences, because we do know through history that there will be unknown and unintended consequences.
Thank you. Does anyone else have thoughts, questions?
So I just wanted to, like, a few things. So something that Vladimir mentioned about the need for additional science, and I think that is one of the key elements of why working in this issue through the Ocean Decade, why working on it with large numbers of like a greater community, to put it that way. So what we are doing is, like, through the Global Ecosystem for Ocean Solutions, is to connect where these initiatives are happening, expand these initiatives. But one of the drivers for that is the need to increase scientific capacity, scientific infrastructure, like ocean observations, all these elements that will be necessary to any opportunity for growing this sector. Now, another thing that came up is like the issue of disinformation, science, and what the area where we are. And a big problem now is, this values issue of systemic change, and how in this debate, what we have at the center of it, I think, for many people, is the fact that they feel that by introducing this new element, we are moving the conversation away from the conversation about like larger systemic change, like political change. Now, are we going to resolve, as we now have like the 29th COP for climate here, are we going to resolve also through this process this larger issue of ideological difference across the world? I think it's pretty difficult. So right now we're trying to solve this at this scale of these experiments, but I think it's a conversation that we cannot lose sight of, because really this model is what we brought us to this point too.
Thank you, Leo. And yeah, as Danielle pointed out, Lucas here is from Hui, and he's actively involved as a scientist in the project that's going on. And so I'm curious, Lucas, if you have any thoughts and reflections on what you're hearing today, and what you've learned by working on the project.
So as Danielle mentioned, me as a scientist, I was never faced before with like that degree of public outreach. It's not something we usually do. We go to scientific conferences, talk science, and now, being engaged or included in this project, we went on this whole spree of outreach events. We went to like roughly 100 now, tribal communities, fishermen, commercial, recreational, legislative bodies, so the whole range. And it's very interesting, also challenging. I mean, we came up to like some events where we were screamed at for 2 hours. It's not nice. So I do believe that because we did this, we heard so much concerns and so many thoughts people had, which we also implemented to some degree in our research plan eventually. And that is really highly important and valuable to us as, doing the science. We heard earlier something along the lines like there needs to be more engagement prior to research. I'm a bit on the other side of this. I feel like the research needs to happen now to then talk more to people, right? Because without having solid scientific background, we can talk and talk and talk, but nothing will change, right? So I do believe that even though there is so much opposition, this science needs to happen now, considering the startups and the commercial interest at stake as well. And
I lost track. It's just something I would want to see is like here at COP, and generally we talk always like we need to take more action, right? But by not letting us do like these initial field trials, which are highly relevant right now, we kind of like limit this kind of step of action, right? So we delay basically the scientific progress in a sense by talking too much. That's my personal opinion.
Thanks very much. I would like to come back to that. I fully agree that we need to do the research now. Better yesterday than tomorrow. And I also agree that it's much easier to communicate with the public based on facts and based on what our findings, our outcome of the research. Because otherwise we run risk that they misinterpret half-true information whatsoever. So I'm totally with you there. But I still believe that we should turn a bit more from curiosity-driven research to demand-driven research by the public. Because talking to them from the very beginning will open many scientific questions that in the end we didn't think of, but it might be super interesting as a scientist. And this will help us go back to them after the research and then talk about facts and numbers.
Just a quick note, that's what I mentioned. We took into our research plan those concerns and thoughts, and because of these interactions, we actually implemented very new aspects to our research plan based on those conversations.
It's such an interesting conversation. I come from engineering. I work at University of Connecticut. But really thinking about kind of the separation between science and public or communication, I would challenge that. I think that kind of the integration that you're noting and that you're thinking about in terms of like the co-design or the participation, like that can do a lot of these things in terms of like highlighting questions that are missed by folks who maybe come from a different area, a different way of thinking, thinking about the scientific infrastructure for using community science, like maybe that's slow, maybe that's full of errors, but it's part of inviting people in and thinking about scientific literacy. And I think, again, I don't know about science specifically, but in engineering we have kind of a false equivalence around, if we invite people in, things will be slower, but then once we go to build these projects, there's so much opposition and transmission lines get shut down because of the public. And it's like, maybe it's slower now because we have not kind of involved folks. So I think there's a lot of parallels there, but I'd kind of argue to a more socio-technical system of rather than like a hyphen or a dualism there.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything?
I can just add a little bit. Hi everyone, my name is Supichar. I'm from Thailand and I work in cultural heritage field, which is like, I think I'm learning a lot from you all, and it's really building up a lot of more understanding on how people like doing with the science and research on the project. But I'm also from the indigenous community. Hi, and I'm my community also in the coastal area. Most of the time that this kind of thing happen is as I am also the person who I'm a youth and something like that. So I understand the emergency of like having all of these research contribute or execute and to get improvement in terms of science and more understanding on how can we move on with this. But also like another concern that would be there is that this is from the really well-established systematic mechanism where things come in, pipeline, and then public, here we hear everything. For example, my country, we have the diversity of people, and not everyone speaking one language, And we have even my neighbor country in Indonesia, we have 1,000 languages in the different islands, no? So for me, what would be concerned would be that it might be challenging for scientists to communicate to everyone in terms of like public to understand what is the advancement or what is the benefits of this kind of thing. And I also work in World Heritage field, so I understand that the pure informed consent process, even it established, sometimes it might not really working well. They come in, they give us a sheet of paper, we sign, we don't know what it is, and before we knew our land already inscribed, and it's just like that. So as much as I value the power and the importance of science, I would think that the assessment before you execute something on site to ensure that you didn't do some impact that irreversible would be really, really critical, because like irreversible, like in World Heritage terminology, we would say like this is whatever can make change into our neighborhood, environment, culture, is a change that makes some impact, positive or negative, right? So it would be really nice to have that information before you want to ask to do something there, and to communicate with the people. It would be really nice also to have someone, maybe like educator or someone who makes this science, a language that people understand. I mean, I understand that, but like maybe not everyone would do. So yeah, that's what my concern, and it would be great to like hear more on how it can be done.
Yeah, and to build on that, I completely agree. Something that we've been talking about is that when you're forming your, what we call PI team, your science team, to have someone on there that is an engagement specialist, a social scientist, I think is so key. And in places like Woods Hole and other science organizations valuing that. Right? It's not just about publishing papers and doing the science, but that engagement, that having that sort of person on your team from the get-go, informing everything, I think is so key. So I agree.
Thanks everyone for an interesting discussion. From my experience, I agree with everybody. Communication is an obstacle, science communication to the public and education, but another obstacle that perhaps wasn't touched upon is public trust of scientists. And I feel like I see heads nodding. I feel like this is a big obstacle for communication, particularly with some stakeholders that feel like we're coming in to regulate or to change things, change livelihoods. I just wanted to get your thoughts as a panel, what steps you've taken to kind of overcome this obstacle.
Thank you. And I will note that we only have a few minutes left, so I'll offer it to the panel if anyone who wants to answer that question as a wrap-up question, but we'll try to wrap up in just a few minutes.
Thanks. I think that's a really excellent point, and I'll be really brief because I know others may have thoughts, but I think transparency of the work that you're doing is really fundamental in building trust, so sort of being upfront about communicating the data, and especially at NOAA and other places, we really try to make our data publicly available so people can see how it was derived, understand where it came from, be accessible to answer questions, that sort of thing. So I think that's part of the key there, but I think that's a really excellent point.
If I could, this is not AGU's first foray into scientific ethics. We were the leading organization in establishing, for example, the fact that sexual harassment in science should be the equivalent of scientific misconduct. We hold our scientists to a code of conduct and an ethical standard that perhaps isn't understood or respected. When there's any allegation of any wrongdoing or anything that might violate it, it gets investigated, action is taken when it's appropriate. So we try to communicate that as well. We have other fundamental beliefs, like the fact that science is borderless, that just because there's a political boundary between two areas, the science permeates both of those things. So we try to uphold those standards and communicate them to the public, to people who may be impacted by the work that AGU scientists do, and try to elevate their standing and the trust in them.
Any other panelists? Final thought?
Yeah, this is something that we face more and more, this distrust of science, especially in the country I'm from, the United States. It's very important to us, and as communicators, we do not put out any content that hasn't been vetted by our scientists. To us, that's like so important. We're also very transparent, right? Transparent on who our funders are and putting the data out there. right? And so like that to us is very important because that's obviously important to others. Where are you getting your funding? And so we do everything we can to back up what we're putting out there with our science, with the data, and informing folks.
Thank you. And I will allow Leo or David to say one last comment briefly if you'd like.
Sure. Again, just thank you for the organizers for the invitation. It's been an honor to sit here. Yeah, I don't want to be repetitive, but I do think that, of course, these are exceptional times, and we do need to find innovative solutions, and I do think innovation is important. But again, I just caution, I guess, from the principle of the precautionary principle, and just also maybe going back to the framework of research and community engagement. And considering this is such a, I guess, new field, or in terms of understanding the long-term effects, I think it does warrant maybe throwing away the traditional scientific community engagement rulebook and really coming up with a much more augmented approach to engaging the community. And it's not just indigenous communities. This affects us globally. So I do respect the research, but I also do caution the risk versus reward ratio. I think the nations, and particularly indigenous communities, need to know, and it needs to be articulated, what is the risk and what is the reward. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Echoing the how grateful we are for this invitation, for this event today. 2 points. One is absolutely the need for a socio-technical approach to this. All these pieces are really not only scientific, they just overspill everywhere, and it's a major emerging political, scientific, technical challenge. And that connects to the next point, which is this is not coming from a place of people who have like dark interests or are trying to do something just for the sake of, okay, let's just because we can do it, we will do it. This is coming from a major problem that we are facing, which is we are running out of options to keep the climate at a certain level. Now we're talking about all these scenarios for under 2 degrees. And this is an opportunity that needs to be explored, needs to be understood, and we have science as the best path that we know so far to understand this problem. So we should continue doing that exploration, and I think it will be very important to do it in an appropriate, ethical, equitable way.
Thank you, Leo. And yes, wonderful last thoughts for closing. And I think it goes without saying that I think that's a really good point, that this is coming from a place, not a place of darkness, but it also needs to be said that this cannot replace emissions reduction. So first and foremost, that is the primary goal. And I really appreciate the conversation that we shared here today on how we can approach mCDR from an ethical, equitable way and conduct proper engagement. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all of you as well for engaging. I really appreciate the discussion. And we'll do a photo up here.